Okay. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining today's Uyghur Wellness Initiative's webinar, holding on coping with family separation in the Uyghur community. First of all, I would like to introduce Uyghur Wellness Initiative very briefly. The Uyghur Wellness Initiative was established to support the emotional, mental, physical, and social well-being of Uyghurs in the diaspora. Since 2020, we have been connecting community members with culturally sensitive mental health professionals and life coaches, organizing educational webinars and wellness activities, and creating safe space where Uyghurs can share, heal, and support one another. So today's conversation addresses an experience affecting countless Uyghur families: prolonged separation from homeland, especially parents, children, siblings, and other loved ones in our homeland. Family separation is not only a physical separation, it creates uncertainty, grief, fear, guilt, and loneliness, and deep sense of helplessness that many of us experience almost every day. Many Uyghurs have gone years without hearing the voices of their loved ones or knowing whether they are safe or not. Today, we will discuss how family separation affects Uyghurs emotionally and psychologically, and how families are continuing to hold up and hold on despite these painful circumstances, and how individuals and communities can strengthen resilience and preserve hope. And please allow me to introduce Dr. Henryk Szadziewski, who's main host of speaker of today's webinar. Dr. Szadziewski is the Director of Research at the Uyghur Human Rights Project in Washington, D.C. He's a longtime researcher and writes on Uyghur human rights, Chinese government policies in East Turkestan, and the experience of Uyghurs in the diaspora. He's the author of the recent report, Fading Ties: Uyghur Family Separation as a Tool of Transnational Repression. And his research examines how systematic disruption on family communication affects Uyghurs abroad, and how family separation is used to create fear, silence, emotional pressure across borders. Honestly, this issue is also very deeply personal to me and to my friends around me in the United States, in Turkey, in other parts of the world. Like many Uyghurs in the diaspora, my friends and I have experienced separation from my family and understand some of the hardship, uncertainty, and emotional pain that come with being unable to live freely in the free world, also with the people that we love. So, Henry, with that, I would like to start my first question. I recently actually joined the in-person event in DC, and it was about your report, Fading Ties. So, could you begin by introducing the central findings of your report, Fading Ties? What did your research reveal about the skill and the nature of family separation experienced by the Uyghurs in diaspora?
Thank you, Mustafa, for the introduction, and it's a real honor to be having this conversation with you, and certainly appreciate and admire your sharing of your experience too. Also, I do want to thank, before we get started, the incredible resource that is the Uyghur Wellness Initiative for suggesting this webinar, and also to the audience for joining this discussion. And I hope that some of this will resonate. So the title of the report, Fading Ties, what it examines is how the Chinese government uses family separation and enforced isolation as deliberate tools of transnational repression against the Uyghur diaspora. The way I went about this, the methodology is that I drew on 6 semi-structured interviews. And I'm going to name the individuals because I'm going to use their words throughout my responses. These are their experiences, and I'm the person who collected those. There are Perhat Ablajan, Enver Yusuf, Meryem, and Reyhan Gul. These are, of course, not their real names. I've had to anonymize them, but their names will come up in my responses. So these interviews, I did them about a year ago, June to July 2025. Some were in the United States, some people were in Turkey. I also examined media and NGO reporting from 2024 to 2025. So I really wanted to get a snapshot of what we know now. Well, with all 6 interviewees, the loss of contact began no earlier than 2016, except in the case of Reyhan Gul. Her brother was detained in 1998, and she last spoke to him in that year, 98. So we're talking nearly 3 decades of separation in that case. But for most people, 10 years was the sort of most that they had experienced. Some of the common mechanisms that identified that induced this forced separation was the detention or coercion of relatives inside the homeland, but also, on the diaspora side, fear, self-censorship of reaching out as well, in addition to sustained psychological pressure. Regarding the scale, I spoke to the researcher, Dr. Mehmet Emin, who has written about this, cited his work, and his estimates, according to his community surveys, is about 70% of Uyghurs in the US lost contact with their families between 2016 and 2019. So at the, we're talking about the real height of the internment campaign. The Xinjiang Victims Database, which I hope that we're all familiar with, which documents the genocide against the Uyghurs, that database records 8,228 individuals who have relatives or friends overseas. And this is important because this was one of the, having a relative or a friend overseas was one of the so-called reasons for internment of Uyghurs. 304 cases in the Xinjiang Victims Database recorded the reason explicitly for detention was having relatives abroad. 1,414 people out of that 8,228 number haven't been heard of in over a year. So I hope that kind of gives you an idea of the scale and some of the mechanisms that were involved and documented in the report.
Thank you. So in your report, you mentioned the transnational repression. So I want to ask, why is it important to understand the separation as a form of transnational repression rather than simply a consequence of distance or migration or some other political reasons?
Yeah, I mean, this is an important question to ask. And so it's not an ordinary difficulty of staying in touch across borders. Even in this day and age, communication is so simple and cheap. You just need a connection to the internet and a device as well. What this is that contact was actively severed by state action, which is quite different. This is, cases that were of police forcing relatives to relay scripted messages to their family members in the diaspora, even so far as mothers instructing their children never to call again out of fear for the consequences. And then also security agents directly approaching diaspora members abroad. One individual, this is Enver, this offers the clearest example. Chinese security services contacted him outside China in 2017, and they offered him a family reunion in a third country. And this was in exchange for intelligence on the Uyghur diaspora. This is just an ordinary individual who's just living his life, being made this kind of offer from the security services. He refused, and the result of that is that he lost contact with his family. and it's a real clear example of the Chinese state reaching across borders. So transnational repression in order to control someone who's not in their territory. For me, the way that when I heard the testimonies, I thought that, this is another form of collective punishment that's being imposed on the Uyghurs. Families being used to silence advocacy abroad, coerce compliance. This is just not about, it's not a byproduct of physical distance.
Yeah, as you mentioned, all these people you interviewed haven't spoken with their parents, relatives, siblings for years. And a lot of us that I know around me are experiencing the same thing almost every day. And because of the transnational repression, as you mentioned, like getting calls from the security or being forced to meet them somewhere else, just like Enver had, it has a lot of mental and emotional toll on us. So my next question is, like many Uyghurs, we haven't spoken with our parents and children or siblings and don't know some of the people, they don't even know if their relatives are safe, dead, detained, or maybe they are somewhere else. We have no idea. And so, what emotional and psychological effects did you observe among the people that you interviewed for the report? We are talking about 6 or 7 people that you spoke, but I'm sure there are a lot of others experience very similar issues in different levels. So I just want to, I'm just curious because I remember that I had interviews in the past for another with another reporter. I was sharing the emotional impact and mental health challenges that I went through. I just want to know what did you observe when you had interviewed this 6 people?
Yeah, this is a real critical question, Mustafa, and it really does speak to the bravery of the people who I interviewed to share this kind of information with a researcher from outside of their family, and to also go public. And it's, for me, I think that those people in the audience who are unfamiliar with the impact of family separation in the diaspora, it's really key to listen to this piece, because I think that this was some of the most heartbreaking testimony that I heard throughout my interviews. Particularly, I mean, grief was one, that grief without closure. Ablajan, I mean, these are just, I'm going to give you a few quotes here. He just said he doesn't even know if his parents are dead or alive. 8 years of no contact, and he's starting to struggle to even recall their voices. And this sort of, these kinds of testimonies made me think about the title itself, these idea of these fading ties that people are having in the diaspora. Perhat, he also learned about not only his grandmother's death, but his father's death years after they had happened. There's no chance to say farewell. You can't take part in mourning rituals. And what he told me was, I feel guilty all the time because I've caused problems for my family. And that delayed or indirect news is a recurring pattern. It's only like snapshots of information, even if you do get it. And sometimes it might be years after the event has occurred. These are milestone events in people's lives. Enver, coming back to Enver, he learned about his father's death 2 weeks after it happened. And Miriam, discovering that people in her extended family had been taken to camps years after the event had occurred. Again, another example, Reyhan Gul. She was living in exile with her mother. She had to call her sister in the homeland to tell her that their mother had passed away. She couldn't say it directly. She had to just say a coded language that said that she had felt sad. And in some ways, the two sisters understood what had happened. After that conversation, Reyhan Gul's sister in the homeland said, "Don't call me again." And Reyhan Gul just said to me, "This is one of the worst experiences of my life." Beyond these direct ties between children and their parents and siblings. There are also intergenerational effects too. An individual, Yusuf, he said that his children have never met his parents, their grandparents. Yeah, the idea that it breaks this, this lineage of cultural transmission through the generations. So some of the consequences, again, I'm citing Dr. Mehmet's research, finding elevated rates of suicidal ideas and depression among Uyghur diaspora, Uyghurs, particularly in the 25 to 45 year range. And that being also compounded by taboos around discussing mental health too.
Thank you for sharing. Yeah, you mentioned Ablajan's grief and Anwar's wellness challenges, and also Mariam's case. To me, yeah, well, we as a human being, we go through grief, survivor's guilt sometimes, but I'm just curious. I want to hear your opinion about how does this uncertainty differ from the ordinary grief, where a person has an opportunity to mourn and find some closure. Like people like Anwar, Ablajan, Mariam, and my friends around me, I don't think we have found any closure yet, because it's been really challenging, and it's been not only maybe challenge is a very light word to express how we feel at the moment. It's sometimes we even struggle to express our emotion. So in your observation, how is this different from ordinary grief? And with that, I want to ask another question. So I think it's better to combine them together. Yeah, you mentioned survivor's guilt, and many Uyghurs abroad, we indeed feel guilty for being safe, or sometimes we fear that speaking publicly may place our relatives in danger. So, how do fear, guilt, and responsibility toward family members influence the daily lives and discussion of Uyghurs in diaspora in your findings?
Yeah, so grief is always a difficult period of anybody's life. We all experience it, and ordinary grief is what we're using as a term here. It doesn't. We all experience it differently, is what I want to say here. However, when conditions, when you don't have a very repressive state that's reaching across borders as a presence, there is generally an event that you share with others, a timeline, rituals that help you to process and get to the point of closure, if ever, right? I mean, but I think that what was very, very common across the board here was this idea of ambiguous loss, not knowing if a parent's alive, detained, dead, sometimes for years. I mean, this is very, very difficult stuff to carry for so many years. That, as I mentioned, that inability to attend those morning rituals, that it's unresolved, and that's an emotional weight that really does not ease over time, which is how grief does happen. That process is, takes time. Rehangul, I'm putting a different spin here in the fact that Rehangul told me that the way that she handled this was to have this sort of coexistence of a full daily life along with the unresolved sadness or sorrow and grief. And this is her quote. She said, "I'm glad I have a busy life now. However, while I'm living my life, I know that my brother and sisters are alive somewhere, but there is no way for me to speak to them." And meaning just that the uncertainty doesn't resolve, but it's carried alongside the sort of normal life that people live, indefinitely for the rest of their lives, I imagine. So in terms of your question about guilt, I raised the quote earlier about the individual saying that, I do feel guilty for my actions. And I think that this is another important question, because of course it does have implications on the mental health of individuals overseas in the diaspora. first of all, the first impact, I think, is when you receive a call and your family members inside the homeland are explicitly instructing you not to call. Framing, they're saying that contact with me is dangerous. I mean, for those people who are living sort of their day-to-day lives without this, this sort of repressive state presence in their lives, think about that. Your family members telling you not to call you. Ablajan said that that this was the phone call he received in 2017. So people feel guilty for feeling that they're safe abroad. Again, Perhat saying that he's caused problems for his family, but the thing here that's interesting is that people feel a sense of personal responsibility for the harm that's imposed by the state, and that to me is particularly, the lack of control in that situation is particularly alarming. And that fear of retaliation that you were talking about, why people do move towards like non-contact, it's well-founded. There are documented cases where there are a lot, and now we know that the prison system is being used to repress Uyghur people. That there are Uyghurs now who have been sentenced 15 to 20 years in prison for contact with relatives overseas. I mean, let that sink in. 15 to 20 years in prison just for calling or contacting your overseas relative. And so Yusuf told me, if I call my family, there'll be problems. So this is direct contact. People even are avoiding indirect or mediated contact. And Miriam told me quite unequivocally, we don't do any of that stuff. We don't even bother to try to find out, because anything could provoke punitive measures against her relatives in the homeland. And again, another interviewee, Ray Hangul, in this time just said, this is intentional. The government's, Ray Hangul just said, this is the government's revenge and punishment for my living abroad and activism, and with the aim of isolating her.
Yeah, as you mentioned, there are a lot of uncertainties, and family separation is still going on. One thing I observed in the community here, at least, despite the separation and uncertainty, our Uyghur families continue to care for one another and preserve our culture, build new lives. And so, what example of strength, coping, or resilience stood out to you during your research? You mentioned it a little bit. Can you elaborate more on this, like how this 6 interviewees exhibited the resilience and coping mechanism, and what really stood out to you exactly?
Yeah, I mean, I'll outline 3, and the first. Well, before I do that, despite that loss of direct contact, the family ties, it was extraordinary to me how strong they were and central and enduring in people's lives. Every of the 6 people described that they had an emotional connection to their relatives living in East Turkestan, even without any means of speaking to them. So, I mentioned that, Ray Hangul talked about her busy life, marriage, work, children as that source of stability. The also not feeling lonely as well. But again, the coexistence of that life with grief. These weren't individuals that I interviewed directly. I mean, 1 or 2 spoke about their activism, but people who have lost contact are very keen to still be activists in not only their own families' cases, but for the Uyghur movement writ large as well. We all know about Abdurrahim Aghini in Amsterdam. He lost contact with 19 immediate family members. He's been staging his protests consistently. Rizwan Nur Muhammad in New Zealand, lobbied the New Zealand's PM when the Prime Minister went to China to say, hey, here's a case. And others have organized. I mean, in the media I read about Zilala, who walked to the Kazakh border as a symbolic sort of gesture to see the homeland somehow to be connected as well. I think that also, the third and the last one is the one that the report tries to engage in, and certainly what this conversation and your own testimony earlier, Mustafa, is this public commemoration and storytelling. A lot of people have written about their families and the loss of contact too, through this sort of memory-based storytelling, in the absence of contact with their loved ones.
Thank you. I would like to ask my last question before we move to the audience Q&A session. So my last question is about community support and hope. And before I ask this question, I want to give a big shout out to Uyghur diaspora in the United States, because they have been so supportive of me. And I still remember very clearly that how devastated and sad I was when I learned that my dad passed away in June 2022. And community members here, they stood up, they called me, they texted me, and they came all together to hold such a memorable memorial service for my late dad. It was a moment that I kind of re-recognized how lucky I was surrounded by this beautiful, kind people. They were there to support me. And some of the people who came to my father's memorial service, honestly, I don't know them, but they heard about a Uyghur member of the community lost a relative, and they came. And I also witnessed the same thing happen to other friends of mine. And we always went there to show up for our support, to let them know that they are not alone when they were mourning, when they lost their family members. Or we also share the happy moment, like when people have weddings, when we hear people are getting married or having children, we always celebrate it together. So at that point, I feel like I'm so lucky, and we are so lucky to have each other, even though we are experiencing lots of difficulties at the moment. So, in your opinion, or like from your findings, what can Uyghur community organizations and mental health professionals, friends, family members can do to do better support helping living with a prolonged family separation? And how can we help one another and remain hopeful without minimizing the seriousness of the pain?
Yeah, and again, this is so critical to hear your own experiences and your observations, Mustafa, because really I'm just going to reflect a lot of what you're saying here. Okay, this is the perspective of an outsider. Of course, I'm not Uyghur, right? So this is what I just see from the outside. I mean, first of all, you have to heap tons of praise on the Uyghur diaspora for its organization in exile. And this is, of course, since 2016, 17 and the beginning of the genocide. But prior to that, too, the organization to support community beyond the sort of human rights documentation and political side of things, but the community efforts, whether they're formal through the organizations, but informal ones. And I know that some of that is a transference of the networks that existed in the homeland, whether among women sharing chai or other kinds of of cultural practices too. The very, very core of Uyghur diaspora organization is so impressive, and to actually respond to the mental health crisis that arose from 2016, 2017 onward, one of the expressions of that being family separations and a host of other issues too, just demonstrates the ways in which the community have really responded And as you say, some people who are in isolation as well, without their families, but they're overseas receiving that support across, and it happens in the US and all in many of the different spaces that we see Uyghur diaspora members. Again, I'm going to return to what does the report model in response to your question? I think the peer testimony sharing, in this case, it was very public through the report, but there are other venues to do that. It can be private, it can be, and again, I'm not a clinician, right? So these are things, if you're experiencing these things, you most certainly need to reach out to professionals or to people trusted within your network. I think also, highlighting the documentation efforts that are trying to understand what's happening within the region as well, help people learn about what's happened to relatives. Public solidarity can help if that is within the comfort of an individual. But I think that regarding hope without minimizing pain, and what I try to do in the report is frame this family separation. It's a human rights violation. It's not just a personal hardship. China is actively violating the rights of Uyghurs in the diaspora and also, of course, in the homeland too. It's a human rights violation. And if we name it that way, it validates the things that people are experiencing, rather than asking them to move on or to, kind of find some other solution. But this is an active harm being caused by the state. Now, I'm going to just use 1 minute to say that, given that it's framed as a human rights violation, there is a responsibility for governments, civil society, the international organizations to step up here. I think that the right to communicate with family is being actively violated in the Uyghur case. There are ways in which governments themselves could advocate for family reunification. They have humanitarian, diplomatic channels. If they're not willing to speak up about the problem writ large, then the names are there. People know the names, and governments can say these names to the Chinese government and say, these people have not been able to speak. I would also say, monitoring and documenting transnational repression systematically will make a difference too. But also countering state propaganda coming out of China. Very famously, I believe it was in 2021, Zulhayat Ismail and then also Eligen Hayat, right, said, hey, all of the Uyghurs can communicate with each other across borders. The problem is that they've lost their phone numbers, or they work for some kind of separatist organization, so they don't want to contact them. These are lies. We need people with authority to say this out publicly. Last thing I'm going to say about this is fund programs that address trauma, cultural preservation, intergenerational connection. And you couldn't do any better than starting with the Uyghur Wellness Initiative.
Yeah, thank you, Henry. Also sharing what changes you would like government, international organization, and civil society groups to make after reading this report. And it was very timely, important report, and very educational, and it has a lot of data too. So I encourage all the audience who haven't read the report to go to UHRP website. It's there. So now we will move to the Q&A session for the audience. Again, thank you, Henry, for sharing this important findings and reflections. So we would like to invite questions from our audience, but please submit it through YouTube comment section, and we will try to address as many as possible during this remaining time. But for those who are concerned about your identity, and if it's because the subject matter itself is sensitive, and what we are discussing today is sensitive. So for those, we kindly ask you to protect your personal and family information when submitting questions, and please don't share name or identifying the details that could place anyone at risk. So with that, let me check the comments section. Please allow me to read it. Okay. I've got a question from an audience say, how does this family separation and pressure affect advocacy, community participation, and the person's willingness to share their experiences?
Yeah, I mean, I would also be really interested to hear your own thoughts on this, Mustafa, too. Having you're an insider. My own my own perspective is that the way it impacts it is that, of course, people are self-censoring. People are the fear has now entered into the equation for people when they're making their personal decisions on whether to, what level of contact they should have um, with their relatives, but also the level of, when you speak out, this makes you public, and then this will have an impact on your family too. Now, look, China knows this very well. It's part of the strategy. The coercion by using family members is particularly insidious. Leveraging those personal relationships to ensure that a very skewed, biased narrative about what's happening to Uyghurs becomes the accepted narrative globally, is part of this strategy. Look, at the end of the day, researchers such as myself are people who are looking at this from, this issue from the outside. The Uyghurs themselves are the experts. They have the experience. They are going through these turbulent times and know exactly what is going on. And I think that to make the step to speak out publicly is a brave one, and everyone has to make their own personal call. But I think that the impact is one that, where you're starting to see a scaling back of public testimony, and look, in the way of trying to figure out what you want to do, it makes a rational choice in some cases. But I mean, Mustafa, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, lots of thoughts, but in terms of advocacy, I would say, yeah, the pressure from the Chinese government, the security personnel of the Chinese government, or threatening calls can really affect our psychology. And so some of like if you look at 2019 and 2021, and you look at now, you see some of the advocates kind of disappear from the horizon due to many reasons, and some really burn out. We do, because advocacy work is not that easy. It is very personal, of course, and we feel it's our responsibility to do that, to be the voice of voiceless people in our homeland. But at one point, it's very exhausting because it takes a lot of energy, courage to speak up. And then, because of transnational repression, again, taking our family members as hostage, like at one point, some of us like decide to just step back a little bit. And again, it's totally fine. Self-care is important. I think I mentioned this in one of the previous webinar I spoke at the Uyghur Wellness Initiative. It takes time to recover. So, but I'm still hopeful that I'm when I look at the new generation, like in their early 20s, or like those 14, 15, 16, they're speaking up. And I'm very hopeful that Uyghur voice will not be erased that easily. With the community participation and with the support from the community, of course, I think more people will be sharing their experience. I think it's a matter of time and energy. Yeah. But again, it is important for those advocates. Like, if I don't know who asked this question exactly, but in terms of the pressure affecting the advocacy, yeah, because of the TNR that we talk about daily these days, it's okay to take some time off, do some self-care activities.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I mean, I found your response incredibly fascinating, and I really appreciate what you're saying about how, generationally there are different kinds of responses to these family separations. And I think what was really encouraging from what you were saying, Mustafa, is the engagement of younger Uyghurs, and looking at the issue in fresh ways and different perspectives, and bringing their own life experiences into what we understand about the not just family separation, but the right situation, writ large. So I really appreciate that comment.
Great. And there are two more questions. The next one, I feel like it's for life coach or uh, wellness professionals, but I would like to hear about your um, opinions. So, what can individuals do when they feel overwhelmed by sadness, helplessness, or the continuing uncertainty surrounding their families?
Yeah, I think your qualification at the beginning is absolutely correct, Mustafa. And I've already said this. My training is in the social sciences, and I don't have the kind of specialized knowledge required here. I mean, what I would say, okay, so here the coping strategies that people told me, right, in the interviews, and we talked about Rehangul, right, with structured daily life, work, family, routine, that being something that was helpful. I think that for some people, when they thought it was safe, rather than living in silence, they did go and seek indirect information. I don't know how useful that particular strategy is. I think that because it's so fractured, it's so as I said, fragmentary in its information. But that was a strategy that some people pursued, and I'm just relaying that. But so this is something, goes back to something that you mentioned, Mustafa, which is community and peer support. Yeah, the cultural taboos or taboos writ large. I mean, these cultural taboos are not unique to Uyghurs. They exist in all kinds of societies where you have to discuss or deal with mental health. But normalizing those conversations within the communities it does matter. But what I want to say here again, if you're feeling this, you're affected by this, it's reaching out to a mental health professional. The Uyghur Wellness Initiative, particularly, I think and I know that the Uyghur Wellness Initiative has done work on working with culturally knowledgeable mental health professionals. So anyway, yeah, that's there's lots of caveats attached to what I just said.
Okay, thank you. I will read we don't have much time left, but I will read the last question from the audience. As a Uyghur, I constantly struggle with a painful dilemma. Should I speak out to protect my people and advocate for justice, or remain silent because doing so could put my loved ones at greater risk? What would you recommend? Before you reply, I think this is a question I think some of my friends always ask, like whenever they decide to speak out or what, like, it's a bit tricky one because we have witnessed different scenarios. Some of the community members speak out. It worked out, but in some cases it went worse. So yeah, Henry. So the individual is asking, what would you recommend? What are your suggestions based on your report findings and your conversation with the people that you interview for this report?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can anticipate what I'm going to say. It's really a personal calculation, and very specific to your own case. Again, it's really important what you said, that in some cases it's worked out and in others not. what is the formula here? It's unsure. I wish I had a better answer. For people to do that. When people do speak out, those voices really do need to be listened to because and respected because of the kinds of consequences that can't become attached to speaking out on behalf of their family members or the movement writ large.
Mm-hmm.
It's the problem with not being so definitive is because you see how this transnational repression works within these spaces, and this is the regretful piece. But I think that it really does come down to, first of all, your own personal calculations, but also talking it through as well. I mean, this in the Uyghur situation, it's hard for me to make that kind of recommendation.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you. Thanks a lot. So today's conversation reminds us that family separation is not only a human rights issue. It is also a serious emotional and psychological and community wellness issue. So many Uyghurs are carrying grief that has no clear ending, questions that have no answers, and worries that they cannot easily share. So at the same time, our community continue to demonstrate remarkable courage as we witnessed, and love and resilience. Holding on does not mean that we must always appear strong or carry our pain alone. It can also mean asking for help, speaking with someone we trust, with our friends, maybe if you have a mentor, with our mentor, right? And supporting one another. Just like what I said, like what happened to me when I lost my dad, how family members, community members all came together to show their support and creating meaningful ways to preserve our family relationships, memories, language, and culture. So, on behalf of the Uyghur Wellness Initiative, we sincerely thank Dr. Henryk Szadziewski for his important research and for joining us today. Thank you, Henry. And we also thank everyone who watched or who's watching and our live today, and to those also submitted questions and supported this conversation. I would like to end this webinar talking about a little bit about the Uyghur Wellness Initiative and what they do exactly. So the Uyghur Wellness Initiative provides confidential support and can help connect the Uyghur community members with culturally sensitive counselors, therapists, and life coaches. As someone who got benefit from this organization and from the service, I highly recommend anyone who's listening at the moment or might watch this video later, connect with the Uyghur Wellness Initiative. They can put you with very well trained counselors and life coaches. And to learn more and request support and participate in our programs, please contact again Uyghur Wellness Initiative or UWI through website, email, telephone number, or social media pages. You may also subscribe to our YouTube channel to receive information about future webinars and wellness programs. The website is, as you can see on the screen, and telephone number and email is uyghurwellness@gmail.com. And we have social media as well, like Facebook, Instagram, and X. Please follow us, and YouTube channel. So I would like to end by saying, even when the distance separates us, care, memory, community, and hope can keep our relationships alive. So thank you for joining us, and please remember that you don't have to face this pain alone. We are all together. We will help each other, and we have the resources available, so please reach out. Thanks a lot. Thank you, Henry.
Thank you so much, Mustafa.